The notebook was a cheap thing, black cover spiral bound, the kind you could buy in a pack of 3 at any drugstore in America. Detective Decker Royce had carried one every single day for 22 years. He had filled hundreds of them. He had written things in those notebooks that would stop a rumbled confessions, last statements, the clinical language of violence, reduced to lines on a page. He had learned long ago that the notebook did not care what you wrote in it. It just held the words until someone needed them. He opened it now, standing in the middle of Hargrove Diner in Boise, Idaho, at 9:14 on a Tuesday night in November, and he wrote 4 lines. Female subject, 5 feet 3 inches, approximately 118 pounds. 3 male subjects incapacitated. He paused, looked at what he had written, then added the last line. Duration of incident 17 seconds. He stared at that for a moment. Then he drew a line beneath it. Then he drew another line beneath that. Across the restaurant, past 2 overturned chairs and a bread roll that had come to rest against the base of the salad bar, the woman stood near her table adjusting the sleeve of her jacket, not breathing hard, not scanning the room with wide eyes, not shaking. She looked the way a person looks after returning from the restroom. Composed, slightly inconvenienced. Done. Decker Royce had worked 847 use of force cases in 22 years on the Boise Police Department. He had interviewed Olympic athletes, combat veterans, a professional boxer who had once knocked a man clean through a plate glass window. He had seen people do extraordinary things under pressure. He had seen the body move in ways the mind could not fully explain afterward. He had never written those words before. 17 seconds. He looked up at her again. She was still adjusting her sleeve. He closed the notebook and slid it back into his jacket pocket and thought just for a moment that he should have stayed home tonight. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand who Elena Voss is, you have to understand who Frank Voss was. And to understand Frank Voss, you have to go back to a mountain range in eastern Afghanistan, to a province called Kunar, to the morning of March 14th, 2009. The air temperature at 0600 was 11 degrees Fahrenheit. The elevation at the firebase sat just over 5,200 feet. The unit that moved out that morning was a 12-man element, Special Forces designated for a reconnaissance task in the Korengal Adjacent Valley System, a stretch of terrain that American commanders had been calling one of the most dangerous places on Earth for the better part of 3 years. They were not wrong. Sergeant Major Frank Voss was 41 years old. He had been in the Army for 19 years. He had deployed 6 times. He had a wife named Carol back in Fayetteville, North Carolina, who taught 3rd grade and made cornbread from scratch every Sunday. He had a daughter named Elena, who was 11 years old and could already outshoot most of the men in his unit on a static range. He carried a photograph of both of them in the left breast pocket of his uniform, next to his heart, the way soldiers have carried such things since men first went to war. The patrol made contact at 0842. The details of what happened in that valley over the next 23 minutes belonged to classified after-action reports and the private memories of the men who survived. What is known, what the men who came home would carry for the rest of their lives, is that Frank Voss held a covered position at the rear of the element while 3 of his teammates extracted under fire. He held that position until they were clear. He was still holding it when the firing stopped. They recovered his body that afternoon. He was brought home in a flag-draped transfer case with full military honors to the base chapel in Fayetteville that could not hold everyone who wanted to be there. Elena sat in the front row in a black dress that was slightly too big for her. She was 11 years old and she did not cry during the ceremony. She watched the folded flag pass from one set of white-gloved hands to another until it reached her mother, and she watched her mother press it against her chest, and she understood with the clarity that children sometimes find in the worst moments of their lives that her father was not coming back and that the world had just permanently rearranged itself around that fact. After the ceremony, a master sergeant she did not recognize pressed a small object into her hands without explanation. A notebook, black cover spiral bound, her father's handwriting on every page, shooting charts, wind tables, range calculations, notes in the margins that were half technical and half something harder to name, the handwriting of a man who thought precisely and felt deeply and rarely showed either. She turned to the last page. One line, Frank's hand. Don't use this to start anything. Use it to finish what has to be finished. She closed the notebook, put it in her coat pocket. She kept it there in one pocket or another for the next 16 years. Frank Voss had started teaching Elena to shoot when she was 8 years old. Not because he wanted to make her into something she had not chosen. Not because he had ambitions she didn't understand. He did it because he believed with the same certainty he believed in everything important, that the world does not announce itself before it moves. He had seen what happened to people who were unprepared for sudden violence. He had carried some of them out. He had written letters to their families. He did not want his daughter to be unprepared. He taught her on a flat stretch of land behind a friend's property in Cumberland County. He taught her breath control before she ever touched a trigger. 4 counts in through the nose hold for 7, 8 counts out. The body finding its stillest point between heartbeats. He taught her to read wind by the movement of grass at the range's far edge. He taught her to calculate distance with her eyes before confirming it with glass. He taught her that patience was not passive. It was the most active thing a person could do because it meant controlling every variable within reach while accepting the ones that weren't. She was a natural. He never said that to her directly because he didn't believe in natural. He believed in hours. He believed in repetition until the movement lived in the muscle and not the mind. But she had his eyes flat and clear, taking in more than they seemed to. She asked the right questions. She understood without being told that what he was teaching her was not about violence. It was about the opposite of violence. It was about never being the thing a situation could feed on. He was dead before she was old enough to understand how rare that kind of teaching was. She joined the Army at 19. It was not a decision she made dramatically. There was no single moment, no speech, no epiphany. She just knew the way she had known since that afternoon in the chapel, that the skills her father had given her were meant for something bigger than a flat stretch of land in Cumberland County. She completed basic training at Fort Leonard Wood. She performed well enough in her first year that she was sent to additional schools. She performed well enough there that doors opened, which most people did not know existed. She was 24 years old when she was assigned to a Tier 1 support element and at Fort Bragg, one of a very small number of women, to hold that designation, a fact noted in her file and nowhere else, because the people in that community did not care about demographics. They cared about what you could do in the dark under pressure without anyone watching. What Elena Voss could do, it turned out, was considerable. 8 years, 6 deployments. A service record that, if ever fully declassified, would read like a list of things not supposed to be possible for someone her size. She operated in environments where the margin for error was measured in inches and seconds. She came home each time. She did what her father's notebook said. She finished what had to be finished. The morning of her discharge, she stood outside the administrative building at Fort Bragg and signed the last page of a stack of paperwork that returned her to civilian life. The officer on the other side of the desk shook her hand and said something about service and honor. She nodded, walked outside into the November air. She stood there for a moment in the cold, holding the discharge folder, and tried to remember what she had thought about before all of this. She could not quite get there. Her mother had asked her to come home to Fayetteville for a few days. She had said yes and meant it. But first she needed something she could not fully name, a few hours of sitting somewhere ordinary and quiet, in a city where no one knew her, where she could exist in the world as a person and not as an asset or a capability. She had a room booked in Boise, a city she had no connection to. That was the point. She was almost to her car when a man she recognized from her previous unit fell into step beside her. He did not say hello. He handed her a manila envelope and kept walking without breaking stride. She looked down at it, her name on the outside in handwriting she did not recognize. She sat in her car for a long time before she opened it. The contents were not long. 3 pages, 2 photographs, a sequence of dates and names that she read through twice slowly the way her father had taught her to read terrain, looking for the thing that was wrong before she could name exactly what was wrong about it. The photographs were timestamped communications, authorization records, routing documents, the kind of bureaucratic paper trail that militaries generate without intending to, that occasionally tells stories their authors would not choose to tell. The name at the bottom of the routing document for the patrol order on March 14, 2009 in Kunar Province was Lieutenant Colonel Warren Doyle, United States Army, retired. Currently serving as Senior Strategic Advisor for Veltran Industries, a private defense contracting firm based in Northern Virginia with $14 billion in active government contracts. The patrol had been routed through a valley approach that every previous intelligence assessment had flagged as a compromised corridor. The patrol had been sent there anyway. The reason given in the file was operational necessity. The reason not in the file, the reason the 3 pages in the envelope gestured at without quite stating outright, was something different, something that required more evidence to prove. But the shape of it was there in the dates and the routing and the name at the bottom of the page. Elena sat in the Fort Bragg parking lot on the morning of her discharge and looked at the name Warren Doyle for a long time. Then she put the pages back in the envelope, put the envelope in her bag, and drove to Boise, Idaho. Before the Army, before Frank's teaching on that flat stretch of land in Cumberland County, there had been a promise. Carol Voss had made the case quietly the way she made all her cases sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a coffee mug, speaking in the measured tone she used with her third graders when she needed them to understand something that mattered. The night before Elena's enlistment date, "Come back, that's all I ask." Elena had said yes, and she had meant yes in every sense of the word, not just alive but whole but present, but belonging to a life rather than a mission. Carol had not said anything more after that. She had refilled her coffee and talked about something else because she was a woman who understood the weight of words and knew that adding more to a promise already made was a way of doubting it. Elena had carried a second promise inside, the first one her own privately kept, that the skills Frank had built in her were for specific circumstances and specific purposes, and that the woman she intended to become in civilian life was not going to be defined by them. She wanted mornings without threat assessments. She wanted to read a menu instead of a room. She wanted to sit in a restaurant on the first night of the rest of her life and be nothing more than a person having dinner. She had 12 hours before that wanting ran into something it could not step around. Hargrove Diner was not famous for anything except its steaks, dry-aged on-site and priced accordingly, and its corner booths deep enough that a person could sit with their back against two walls and a clear sight line to both the front entrance and the kitchen corridor. It was the kind of restaurant that felt expensive without feeling pretentious, where the lighting was low and the jazz was quiet, and the conversations at neighboring tables stayed comfortably private. Elena arrived at 8:47. She wore a charcoal jacket over a white shirt, dark trousers, flat shoes with a sole thick enough to matter if she needed to move quickly. The hostess offered a table in the center of the room. Elena looked at it, then looked at the corner booth along the west wall and asked for that one instead. She sat down and placed her bag beside her on the bench, angling it slightly from parallel to the table's edge, a few degrees that put the opening at the 2 o'clock position relative to her right hand. She had not made that adjustment consciously. Some choices stopped being choices a long time ago. She placed Frank's notebook on the table beside her water glass. She had carried it in a pocket or a bag every day for 16 years. Tonight it felt heavier than it usually did. She did not look at it, she just kept it close. She ordered a glass of red wine and opened the menu and did not read it. Instead, she did what she had been doing since she was 24 years old in places considerably less comfortable than this. She read the room. 41 people, not including staff. A family of 4 near the window. 2 children under 8. Father visibly tired, mother managing everyone's mood. 2 men in business attire with papers spread between their plates. An older couple, mid-70s, not talking much, not needing to. A man dining alone 2 tables back and to her left. 68 years old, approximately large-framed, carrying the stillness of someone who had spent a long time in uncomfortable places and had made peace with it. He was eating soup and reading nothing and watching everything. She filed him the way she filed exits in load-bearing walls. Registered, stored, moved on. Near the host stand, a couple was being seated, a man in his 40s and a woman who appeared to be his wife. The man had the build and watchfulness of someone in law enforcement. He sat facing the room. His wife sat with her back to the entrance. Old habits. Elena knew the feeling. She was on her second sip of wine when they walked in. She heard them before she fully turned to look. A surge of noise at the entrance, not happiness, but the kind of volume that comes from people who have been drinking since early afternoon and have mistaken their own noise for charisma. 3 men. The biggest one was 6'3" and built like someone who had once maintained that size and no longer bothered. Dark hair, red flushed face, the loose quality in his neck and shoulders of a man who had consumed enough to reach the stage where he felt invincible. He scanned the restaurant the moment he crossed the threshold, the way a man scans a room when looking for something to confirm his importance. The one on his left was lean and quick-looking, with the coiled energy of someone who preferred to follow until he didn't. The one on his right was twitchy or nervous under the bravado eyes moving too fast. The hostess approached them. The big one spoke over her, nodding toward the center of the room. Then his gaze moved not at the food, not at the decor, the way a certain kind of man moves his gaze in a public space looking for women dining alone. He found Elena. She saw him find her. She registered it the way she registered wind direction, not as a threat, yet as data. She brought the wine glass to her lips and used the curve of the glass to watch without appearing to watch. The hostess gestured toward the back. The big man shook his head, said something. The hostess hesitated. He was already moving, the other 2 falling in behind him, all 3 angling toward booth 7. At the table near the entrance, the off-duty detective glanced up from his conversation. 3 men moving through the restaurant with directional purpose. He filed it, looked back at his wife. She was telling him something about her day. He nodded. Probably nothing. 2 tables behind Elena, the older man had set down his spoon. He was not looking at the 3 men. He was looking at Elena. His face had changed in a way that would have been difficult to describe precisely, but very easy to recognize if you had ever seen a person look at someone they had thought about for a long time and then suddenly found in front of them. Not surprise, something more layered than surprise, something that had been sitting inside him for years and had just been given a place to land. He said nothing. He did nothing. He sat very still and watched. Elena ran the assessment she had run in 1,000 more dangerous places. 3 subjects. Primary intoxicated, physically dominant, ego-driven, accustomed to compliance. Secondary left, follower instinct, will escalate on cue, possibly more dangerous than the primary once in motion. Secondary right, volatile, likely to act first if spooked. Public environment. 41 civilians. No clear exit that did not pass within arm's reach of at least one of them. Rules of engagement. Civilian setting. De-escalation first. Always start there. The big man arrived at her booth and leaned against the seat back with his arms wide, his cologne arriving several seconds before he did. He was grinning the grin of a man who had decided what was going to happen before he crossed the room. She looked up at him, level, unhurried. "Good evening," she said. Her voice was quiet and each word placed precisely. "I'm just finishing dinner. I'm sure the staff can find you a great table." He laughed. The sound of it was designed to fill space. He slid into the booth across from her, as though the invitation had already been extended, as though her preference were a technicality. His 2 companions positioned themselves at the ends of the table, not touching anything, not seated, just present in the way that made the geometry of leaving more complicated. "You looked lonely," he said. "We're doing you a favor." She kept her voice even. "I appreciate the offer. I prefer eating alone." Something shifted in his expression. Not anger yet. Recalculation. He leaned forward, elbows on the table close enough that she could smell the afternoon's worth of whiskey underneath the cologne. His eyes had the flatness of entitlement confronting the unexpected. "You think you're better than us," he said. It was not a question. Elena said nothing. She was watching all 3 of them, not moving her eyes visibly, just using the width of her vision. The twitchy one on the right was shifting his weight. The lean one on the left had gone still in a way that was different from calm. The detective near the entrance had looked up again. He registered the tableau. 3 men standing around a woman's table, her expression neutral, their positioning deliberate. He made the assessment that experienced law enforcement makes in these situations. She is handling it. Give it another 30 seconds. The big man leaned closer and said something that the ambient noise mostly swallowed, something designed to produce a specific reaction in her. She heard it, processed it, did not react on his schedule. Then he reached across the table and closed his hand around her wrist. He squeezed hard, knuckles whitening. Not a warning. A statement. He leaned in close and said low with the specific ugliness of a man who had never faced real consequences. "You're not going anywhere until we say you can go." Elena looked at his hand on her wrist. She looked at it for exactly the time it took to complete 1 full breath cycle. 4 counts in, hold, 8 counts out. The decision she had been holding since the moment he walked through the door, the careful, disciplined, costly decision to keep the promise she had made to herself, to sit inside the discomfort and find another way out, that decision did not break. It completed. She had given every other option its full measure of time. She had done what her father's notebook said. She had not started anything. But now an old man was about to get hurt because he was the kind of person who stands up in the part of Elena Voss that Frank had built over years of early mornings and patient repetition, said quietly and without drama enough. Not with anger. Anger was a liability. Frank had been very clear about that. With clarity. From the table 2 rows behind her, a chair scraped back. The voice that followed was not a challenge, not a performance, just a man saying a clear thing in a room that needed it said. "Let her go," he said, "before this gets worse." The twitchy one on the right turned, and the night balanced on a fine edge for the last several minutes tipped. Part 2, 17 seconds. Briggs Foss was not a complicated man. He was 31 years old, and he had spent most of those years making quick decisions that felt powerful in the moment and cost him considerably afterward. He had learned in his mid-20s that the fastest way to avoid consequences was to stay close to someone with enough money or connections that consequences had a way of finding other people. Marcus Doyle had both. So Briggs Foss stayed close to Marcus Doyle, and he did what Marcus's mood required, and he did not think too carefully about the shape of what he was doing. When the old man stood up and spoke, Briggs did not think carefully now either. He turned and shoved Gideon Marsh with both hands, a flat palm shove, the kind that carries a message rather than an intent. The problem was that Gideon Marsh was 68 years old, and the edge of the chair caught him at the back of the knee, and he went down sideways, his shoulder taking the impact against the hardwood floor with a sound that was heavier and more final than Briggs had intended. The soup bowl went with him. The spoon rang once against the floor and was still. For 1 second, the entire restaurant operated on its previous assumptions. The jazz kept playing. Somewhere near the kitchen, a server was explaining the evening's specials. A child at the window table was asking her father something that required a patient answer. Then the child's mother pulled both children against her, and the father stood with his arms wide and his eyes on Briggs, and the entire room understood simultaneously that what was happening at Booth 7 had just expanded its radius. Elena was not looking at Marcus Doyle anymore. She was looking at Gideon Marsh on the floor. The decision she had been holding since Marcus's hand closed around her wrist, the careful, disciplined, costly decision did not break. It completed. She had held it as long as it needed to be held. She had given every other option its full measure of time. And now a 68-year-old man was on the floor of a restaurant because he had stood up for a stranger, and the part of Elena Voss that Frank had built was no longer asking permission. Not with anger. Anger was a liability. Frank had been clear about that. With clarity, she became very still for exactly the length of one breath. In the stillness, she processed the room the way she had processed rooms that were actively trying to kill her. 3 subjects. Marcus directly across, hand still nominally on her wrist grip, loosened by a fraction, because confused men loosen their grip. Colt Pruitt, 2 feet to her right, weight shifted forward onto his left foot from the momentum of positioning. Briggs Foss at the far end, 3 feet back, weight on his heels, body angled away from commitment, the posture of a man who wanted to be included in the story without being in it. 41 civilians. The family at the window was already moving toward the back. The business dinner had frozen. The older couple had not moved. Some people go very still in a crisis, and that stillness is its own kind of wisdom. At the table near the entrance, Decker Royce was on his feet. His wife's hand was on his arm, steadying herself rather than restraining him. His eyes were on Elena. She did not look at him. She moved. What happened in the next 17 seconds was not dramatic in the way that violence is usually portrayed. There was no music. There was no slow motion. There were no choices made midair. Elena Voss moved through those 17 seconds the way she had moved through every crisis in 8 years of work that did not appear in any public record, with the quiet efficiency of someone who has reduced a complex problem to its simplest components and is now solving it. Second one. Her left hand came down on Marcus Doyle's wrist, not a strike, a press. The radial nerve runs close to the surface at the inside of the wrist, and if you know precisely where it is and apply the right angle of pressure, the hand opens. Not because the brain decides to open it, because the nerve gives the fingers no other option. Marcus's grip released. He had not yet processed what was happening. Second 2. She was out of the booth, standing. The table between them meant nothing because she was already around it. Seconds 3 and 4. Colt Pruitt was turning back, registering her movement, beginning to recalibrate. He was quick. She was already inside his reaction time. She brought her elbow through in a short horizontal arc, not extended, not swung, driven from the shoulder, with the body's full rotation behind it, and it caught him in the sternum at the precise angle that sends the diaphragm into spasm. Colt folded. He did not fall immediately. He bent forward, both hands going to his midsection, his body doing the involuntary arithmetic of a man who has temporarily forgotten how to breathe. Then his knees found the floor. Seconds 5 through 8. Briggs Foss had been watching from the end of the table, and he made a decision that was understandable and wrong. He lunged. He had 6 inches and 60 pounds on her, and he committed fully, which was the first mistake, because a committed lunge has a direction and a momentum that belongs to whoever gets out of its path. Elena sidestepped. Not far, just enough. Her left hand found the edge of the bread basket on the table as she moved. She did not look at it. Her hand simply found it, the way a hand finds a railing in the dark, and she put the remaining dinner roll directly into Briggs Foss's open mouth as his forward momentum carried him past her. He hit the floor with the roll between his teeth and stayed there, confused in a way that had nothing to do with injury and everything to do with the bewilderment of a man who has just had a bread product deployed against him as a weapon. He would later describe this moment to the responding officers as the most disorienting experience of his adult life. Seconds 9 through 14. Marcus Doyle had recovered enough to be dangerous, which is to say he had recovered enough to be stupid. He came around the end of the table with his weight forward and his arms wide, the posture of a man who intends to use his size as a primary argument. It was the same posture Elena had seen in doorways and stairwells, in buildings without addresses, and the answer to it was always the same: you do not fight the size you redirect it. She stepped inside his reach. Her right hand found his forearm. She turned. His own forward momentum became the mechanism of his undoing, and the corner of the table he had been sitting at a minute ago became the destination. He hit it with the full force of himself. The sound was not subtle. He went sideways and down his back against the booth, his nose at an angle it had not previously occupied and would never fully recover from. He was conscious. He was not in any meaningful sense a problem anymore. Seconds 15 through 17. Elena stood in the center of the space the three of them had occupied. She looked once at Colt still on his knees, once at Briggs still on the floor, once at Marcus cataloging. Then she turned and walked to where Gideon Marsh was sitting up on the floor, one hand pressed to his shoulder, and she reached down and offered her hand. He took it. She helped him to his feet. He was looking at her in a way she could not immediately read. She steadied him until he had his balance, then stepped back. 17 seconds. She picked up her father's notebook from where it had been knocked to the floor beside the booth. She checked the spine. Intact. She put it in her bag. Decker Royce had been on his feet since second 4. He had watched the entire sequence without moving, and the reason he had not moved was the same reason a very experienced professional in any field stands still when witnessing something outside every category he has built, because intervention would have been the wrong answer, and he knew it immediately. He was now doing something she noticed without acknowledging. He had positioned himself between her table and the 3 or 4 people in the restaurant who had pulled out phones at the sound of Colt hitting the floor. He stood with his back to her, facing them, his posture communicating without a word or a badge that they should lower the phones. Most of them did. He was that kind of man, the kind whose bearing alone was a form of instruction. He did it quietly. He did it without looking at her. He did it the way you do something when you have decided it is right and you are not interested in being credited for it. She saw it. She said nothing, but she saw it. The restaurant had gone the quality of silent that happens when 40 people are processing something their existing categories cannot contain. Forks suspended, glasses set down mid-lift, the jazz still playing from inside the walls, which felt in the context of the moment almost satirical. A baby in a high chair near the window, too young to understand anything that had happened, began clapping her hands with pure enthusiasm. No one else made a sound. Elena straightened her jacket. She looked at the room without apology. Then she went to the host stand, took a $100 bill from her wallet, and placed it on the nearest surface. "Apologies for the disturbance," she said. Her voice was even and clear in the silence. "These gentlemen appear to be having a difficult evening." Then Decker Royce stepped toward her badge out and she stopped. He looked at her for a moment before he spoke. He had spent 22 years reading people, and he was currently reading someone who did not read easily. "Detective Decker Royce," he said, "I need to ask you some questions." She looked at the badge, then at him. "I understand," she said. They sat at a table near the kitchen corridor, away from the 3 men now being attended to by restaurant staff and the 2 patrol officers who had arrived in the 8 minutes since someone called 911. Marcus Doyle sat against the booth with a bar towel pressed to his nose, talking to one of the officers in the emphatic, slurred cadence of a man whose sense of injustice had survived his impact with the table corner. Colt Pruitt sat on a chair with his elbows on his knees, breathing. Briggs Foss had finished the roll. Royce opened his notebook, set his pen. "In your own words," he said. She told him, precise and brief and without editorializing. She described the escalation, the physical contact, her response. She used the language of someone accustomed to after-action reports, accurate, stripped of emotion, useful. Royce wrote without looking up. He had interviewed hundreds of people, and he knew the difference between a prepared story and an observed account, and what she was giving him was an observed account delivered with a precision that was notable. When she finished, he looked up. "ID," he said. She reached into her bag and placed her driver's license on the table. He picked it up. "Elena Voss." He turned slightly and pulled out his phone. He searched something, waited, read what came back, read it again. Then he put the phone face down and looked at her with a different quality of attention than before. Not suspicion, something more complex. "Tier 1 support, Fort Bragg," he said. "Not quite a question." "Former," she said. "As of this morning." He absorbed that. His pen was still. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something that has just reorganized the context of everything he has seen in the last 30 minutes. He stood, said, "Excuse me," and walked to where Marcus Doyle sat against the booth. He spoke to one of the patrol officers briefly. Then he crouched in front of Marcus and said something in a low voice. Marcus, whose indignation had been at full volume, went quiet. Royce stood and reached into Marcus's jacket pocket with the practiced ease of a man who had done this 10,000 times and never enjoyed it. He looked through the wallet. His expression did not change. He removed something small, a folded piece of paper the size of a business card, and held it between two fingers. Then he walked back and placed it in front of Elena without touching its surface again. She looked at it. Her name, written in handwriting she did not recognize. Below it, the name of the restaurant and tonight's date. In the noise of the restaurant's aftermath, patrol officers and paramedics, the manager on his phone diners, at various stages of deciding whether to stay or leave the table where Elena and Royce sat, was very quiet. "He knew you'd be here tonight," Royce said. "Somebody told him." She looked at the paper and did not touch it. "I know," she said. He waited. "This morning," she said, "I received something." She paused. "It connects to a matter you likely don't have access to." She looked at him directly. "What I can tell you is that tonight was not random." He held her gaze. He was 51 years old and had been a detective for 22 of those years, and he knew when he was standing at the edge of something larger than the report he had come to write. He also knew that a woman who had done what she had done in 17 seconds and was now sitting across from him, as calm as someone waiting for a bus, was not a person who would be moved by pressure or led by sympathy. She would give him what she chose to give, and not one word more. "Is there a name?" he asked. She considered for a moment. "Warren Doyle," she said. "Former Army, retired lieutenant colonel, senior advisor at a company called Veltrin Industries, Northern Virginia." He wrote it down. His hand slowed for a fraction of a second at the surname, and she saw it slow, and she understood that the name Doyle was not entirely new to him. But she did not push it. She had given him what was useful. He finished writing, set the pen down. He looked at the folded paper on the table between them and then back at her. "Are you safe?" he asked. The question was direct and professional, and it meant several things at once. She appreciated that about it. "Yes," she said. He held her gaze a moment longer. Then he said she was free to go, that there would likely be follow-up in the coming days. He said it in the tone of a formality, because by then they both understood that what had happened in that restaurant was documentable, legal, and completely unambiguous in its justification. She nodded. She stood, put her bag on her shoulder. She was 3 steps from the table when she heard her name. Not from Royce, from the direction of the kitchen corridor. She turned. Gideon Marsh was standing there. His right arm was held slightly away from his body, the unconscious accommodation of a shoulder that had taken an impact and was reporting back. He was looking at her with that expression she had not been able to read before, the one that carried too much history to be simple. She looked at him, really looked the way you look at something you have been trying to place since first registering it. She knew his face, not from tonight, from photographs, from briefings, from a name in a unit roster she had read in a classified context years ago, attached to an after-action report describing a patrol in Kunar province on March 14, 2009. He had been there. He had been on the patrol, one of the 3 men Frank Voss had held a position to bring home. She stood in the kitchen corridor of a restaurant in Boise, Idaho, and looked at one of the men her father had died for, and she felt something she was not prepared to name in a room full of people. Gideon Marsh looked back at her. His jaw was set and his eyes were steady, and she could see that whatever it cost him to be standing here was considerable, and that he was standing here anyway. He'd have waited just as long, he said. His voice was quiet, the way voices are quiet when they have been carrying something for a long time and have finally found the right place to set it down. "Your father. He would have waited exactly as long before he moved. 4 counts in, hold, 8 counts out." She nodded once, slowly, the way you nod at something that does not need a response because it is already complete. Then she walked out of Hargrove Diner into the cold November air of Boise, Idaho, and stood on the sidewalk and breathed. The street was ordinary in every respect. Cars passing, a couple walking a dog, the orange wash of streetlights on wet asphalt from an earlier rain. Somewhere down the block, music from a bar that had no idea any of this had happened. The world had kept going, indifferent, unhurried, full of people going about their lives. She was standing in the middle of it with her bag on her shoulder and her father's notebook inside it, and the cold air moving against her face. She had broken the promise, not the one to her mother. Carol had asked her to come home, and she would. She was still going home. The other one. The promise she had made to herself in a chapel in Fayetteville at 11 years old and reaffirmed 100 times since, and kept through things that had made keeping it very costly. The promise that said the skills her father had given her were for specific circumstances, and that the woman she wanted to become in civilian life was not going to be defined by them. She had not managed 12 hours. She walked to her car and sat in the driver's seat with her hands in her lap and the engine off. Around her, the parking lot carried the aftermath of what had happened inside a patrol car, an ambulance, a small gathering on the sidewalk working through shared adrenaline. She took out her phone. Her mother answered on the second ring the way she always answered, with the particular alertness of a woman who had spent decades waiting for calls she did not want to receive. Mom, Elena said, a half-second of writing in the silence that followed. Carol Voss had been reading her daughter's voice for 27 years. What happened, she said. I'm okay, Elena said first, because that was always first. I'm okay, then I broke the promise. The silence that followed was full rather than empty, full the way silences are between people who share a long history with a particular weight. Which one, Carol asked finally. Her voice was careful, steady. She had always been steadier than people expected. Elena looked through the windshield at the restaurant entrance, where a patrol officer was talking to the manager. The one to myself, she said. Another silence. Longer. Are you hurt? Her mother asked. No. Is anyone else? No, not permanently. Then tell me. So she did. Sitting in the parking lot of Hargrove Diner on the night of the first day of the rest of her life, Elena Voss told her mother what had happened, and Carol listened without interrupting, which was the thing she had always done best. She listened until the story was complete. Then she was quiet for a long moment. You did what you thought was right, Carol said finally. Yes, and someone got hurt who shouldn't have. Elena looked at her own hands in her lap, Gideon Marsh's weight as she helped him up, the sound of his shoulder hitting the floor. Yes, she said. Then that's the cost, Carol said. That's what you carry. You don't put it down, you carry it, and you keep going. Elena said nothing for a moment. He was there, she said. Mom, someone who was with Dad, he was in the restaurant. The silence that followed was different from the others. What did he say, Carol asked. Her voice had changed, very slightly, but Elena heard it. He said Dad would have waited just as long. Carol did not speak for 10 seconds. Elena counted them. Then quietly he was right. Elena pressed her eyes shut, opened them. The parking lot, the patrol car, the ordinary street. I'm driving to Fayetteville tomorrow, she said. I'll be there by afternoon. I'll make cornbread, her mother said. There was nothing else to say after that. They said goodnight. Elena put the phone in her bag next to her father's notebook and sat in the car for a while longer in the cold and the quiet. 17 seconds. She had not started anything. She had finished what had to be finished. The notebook had said so, Frank had said so, and she understood sitting in that parking lot on the first night of her civilian life that the cost of finishing it was not the doing. It was what you had to figure out you were afterward when the doing was done and the world was still asking you to be something. She started the car. She drove. Part 3, what she left standing. The video was 41 seconds long. Someone had filmed it from a table near the window despite Royce's best efforts, and the footage was unsteady in the way phone footage always is when the person holding it is trying to be inconspicuous. It caught the last 14 seconds of the incident. Briggs hitting the floor. Marcus coming around the table to redirect the impact, and then it caught Elena standing in the space where 3 men had been straightening her jacket, the room behind her completely still. It did not catch her face clearly. It caught enough. The video was posted at 11:17 that night by someone whose account had 200 followers. By 6 in the morning, it had 4 million views. By the following evening, 11. By the end of the week, 17 million people had watched a woman in a charcoal jacket solve a problem that most people would have considered unsolvable in the time it takes to soft-boil an egg. The comment section had a quality that comment sections rarely achieve, not the usual competition for cleverness, not the performance of outrage, but something that felt in aggregate like a collective exhale. People writing in full sentences. Veterans writing about the loneliness of competence that nobody around you can see. Women writing about the constant low-level calculation of public spaces, the exits, the threats, the arithmetic of just getting through an evening. Older men writing about their daughters, about what they had hoped to teach them, about whether they had. The top comment liked by more than 200,000 people read, "This is why you treat everyone with respect. You never know who you're sitting next to." Nobody knew her name, not yet. Marcus Doyle was arrested 36 hours after the incident when Briggs Foss, whose loyalty had not survived a night in a holding cell and a morning conversation with a public defender, provided a full account of the phone call Marcus had made before crossing the restaurant. The call had lasted 40 seconds. Marcus had made it from the lobby after reading Elena's name on the reservation board. The number he called belonged to a burner phone that was never recovered. What was recovered through Colt Pruitt's cooperation with the FBI field office in Boise was a chain of communications connecting the burner phone to a logistics coordinator at Veltron Industries who was not supposed to be communicating with anyone outside approved channels about personnel with prior Tier 1 affiliations. Colt Pruitt cooperated comprehensively. He had the instincts of a man who had spent his life reading which way things were falling and moving accordingly. Things were falling away from Marcus Doyle, and Colt Pruitt moved accordingly. Marcus was charged with felony assault, criminal threatening, and 3 counts of battery. His father's law firm sent 2 attorneys from Northern Virginia on the first available flight. They were very good attorneys, and they would eventually negotiate outcomes that fell considerably short of what justice in its ideal form might have preferred. This is how things work when money is paying attention. But the video was already out there, and certain things once seen by 17 million people cannot be unseen regardless of what legal proceedings eventually produce. Decker Royce filed his report Wednesday morning. Thorough, precise, exactly what the evidence supported. He noted that the female subject had acted in clear defense of herself and others, that her use of force was proportional and professional, that she had cooperated fully from the moment the incident concluded. In a separate supplementary document, not part of the public report, he noted the piece of paper found in Marcus Doyle's wallet, his assessment that the evening constituted a deliberate attempt at intimidation rather than an opportunistic encounter, and the name Warren Doyle and the name Veltran Industries. He filed the supplementary document with the FBI field office on a Thursday afternoon. He did not hear back for 3 weeks. Then he heard back considerably. A counterintelligence team formally requested review of the Kunar Province file, an administrative document that had existed in a gray area for 16 years, classified at a level that made it technically accessible but practically invisible. The request cited new evidence pertaining to a contractor personnel decision that may have materially affected the outcome of a classified Special Forces operation in 2009. The review would take months. It would produce findings that were careful and procedural and would never satisfy anyone who had known Frank Voss personally. But it would produce them. The machinery once started ran. Warren Doyle, through his attorneys, declined to comment. He continued in his advisory role at Veltran Industries for another 60 days before the company, in a brief statement, announced that his contract had concluded. The statement thanked him for his service. It did not specify to whom or for what. None of this appeared on television. Some of it appeared in a single paragraph in a trade publication that covered defense contracting, read primarily by people who already knew the shape of it. Justice continued in its way, slower and more partial and more procedural than anyone who needs it would prefer. But it moved. Elena was in Fayetteville when most of this happened. She spent 4 days at her mother's house, sleeping in her childhood bedroom with the window cracked the way she had always preferred it. She ate Carol's cooking and sat on the back porch in the evening with a cup of tea, watching the neighborhood go about its business. The cornbread was exactly as she remembered it. She did not talk much about Boise. Her mother did not press. They had always communicated in a language that did not require exhaustive verbalization, a language developed over years of Carol watching her daughter become someone she had not fully anticipated and choosing to love what she became rather than what she had imagined. On the 3rd day, Carol came out to the porch and sat in the other chair, and they watched the light change in the yard, and after a while, Carol said without particular preamble that she thought Frank would have understood. Not approved necessarily, understood. There was a difference, and both women knew it, and neither pretended otherwise. Elena looked at the yard, the old oak at the property line, the bird feeder Frank had built from a kit the Christmas before his last deployment, never quite leveled properly, still sitting at a slight angle after 16 years, and the birds had adapted to it. "I know he would," she said. On the 4th morning, she told Carol she was going to Denver. Carol asked what was in Denver. "Nothing yet," Elena said. "That's why." Carol looked at her for a moment with the steady eyes of a woman who had watched this daughter for 27 years. Then she went inside and came back with a container of cornbread wrapped in foil. "For the drive," she said. Elena put it on the passenger seat and drove. It was Royce who let slip the detail that connected the video to a name. He had not intended to. He was not a careless man, and he respected privacy in the way that law enforcement officers respect it when they have seen what happens when it is violated. But he was called into a departmental press briefing 3 weeks after the incident, the department's communications office managing the ongoing attention the video continued to generate, and someone asked whether the woman in the video had any military background. Royce said carefully that he was not able to speak to the subject's background in detail. The communications officer, 26 years old and 8 months into the job, tried to be helpful and added that the department could confirm the subject had served in a support capacity with units based out of Fort Bragg. That was enough. It took the internet 4 days to close the remaining distance. Elena Voss, Tier 1 support. Echelon commendation awarded for actions that remained classified, but whose existence was a matter of record. Daughter of Sergeant Major Frank Voss, Delta Force, killed in action, Kunar Province, 2009. The comments section of the video became something else after that. Veterans who had known Frank wrote in. People who had served alongside people like Frank wrote in. The thread became, in the way the internet occasionally becomes something worth reading, a record of people saying true things about service and sacrifice, and the specific invisibility of people who do difficult work without asking to be seen. One thread started by a man who identified himself only as a retired master sergeant from the 75th Ranger Regiment read, "Some people carry their parents as memory. Frank Voss's daughter carries him as skill. That's the highest form of inheritance I know." It had 40,000 replies, most from men who understood exactly what he meant. Gideon Marsh did not comment publicly. He read the threads from his house in a small town in western Montana, where he had lived for 6 years under circumstances that were by mutual agreement with several government agencies not widely discussed. He had a daughter of his own, 23 years old, who called him every Sunday. He had a dog and a wood stove and a truck that needed work he kept putting off. He read the threads about Frank Voss's daughter, and he felt something that had been sitting in his chest for 16 years shift the way a stone shifts when water finally finds its way underneath. He made a call to a lawyer he trusted, a woman who handled veterans affairs, and asked few questions and understood discretion. He had some money set aside, not a great deal, enough. He told her what he wanted to do with it. She told him what the structure would need to look like. He said, "Do it." 6 weeks after Hargrove Diner, a scholarship fund was formally registered with the state of Montana under the name the Voss Foundation. Its stated purpose to support female candidates pursuing advanced training in security tactical operations and protective services, with particular emphasis on applicants from underserved communities. The founding donation was enough to fund 12 recipients in the first year. The donor was listed as anonymous. Elena received a certified letter in Denver in January requesting her signature as the named honoree, not the administrator, not the decision maker, simply the person whose name the foundation would carry. The letter explained that she was not obligated to accept that the fund would operate regardless of her response and that the donor wished to remain anonymous. She sat with the letter for 2 days. On the third day, she called the administrator in Missoula to confirm the paperwork. The woman on the other end was professionally cordial and said very little beyond what the letter had already said. Elena asked one question only because she had learned long ago that the right question was usually the shortest one. "Who?" she said. A pause. Then he asked that we not say. She understood he. She thought about this restaurant, about a 68-year-old man getting up from his dinner, not because he had to, but because a child's father didn't know what to do and someone needed to. About 7 words spoken in a kitchen corridor, in a voice that had been carrying its weight for 16 years and had finally found a place to put it down. She thought about her father holding a position so 3 men could get out. She thought about what it means to spend a life paying a debt that no accounting system can ever fully calculate, and to keep paying it anyway quietly in the forms available to you. She signed the letter, mailed it back the same afternoon. 2 weeks later, a postcard arrived with no return address. A photograph of western Montana on the front mountains, first snow, a landscape that requires nothing from you and offers everything. On the back, 4 words in handwriting she had never seen before, but recognized immediately as belonging to someone who had spent years choosing their words with care. He would have known. She put the postcard on the shelf she had built in the northwest corner of her warehouse, next to Frank's photograph, next to his notebook. She stood there for a moment with her hand on the shelf's edge, not performing anything for anyone, just being in the room with the things that mattered. Then she went back to work. Denver in January is a particular kind of cold, dry, and clarifying with altitude behind it that makes everything slightly sharper than it ought to be. Elena had rented a small house in a neighborhood on the western side of the city close to nothing in particular, which was part of why she had chosen it. She spent the first 3 weeks walking the grid of the neighborhood, learning its rhythms, eating at the same 3 places until the owners recognized her and stopped asking what she wanted. She found the warehouse in February. It sat on the eastern edge of an industrial corridor in the process of becoming something else, a brewery on one end, a climbing gym on the other, the space between still raw and unfinished. 1,200 square feet concrete floor, 2 windows on the north wall, a loading door on the east side that rolled up and let in a rectangle of Colorado sky. It needed work. She signed the lease in March. She spent 6 weeks on the interior herself, painted the walls, laid interlocking rubber mats dense enough to absorb impact, installed lighting that was bright without being clinical, built a small office space in the northwest corner with a folding table, 2 chairs, and a shelf. On the shelf, she placed 3 things: Frank's photograph, the good one from Fort Bragg in 2007, a citation from an operation she was allowed to acknowledge without specifying, and the black spiral-bound notebook worn at the corners, the cover slightly bowed from 16 years of coat pockets. She did not frame any of it. It was a shelf, not a shrine. The distinction mattered to her. The sign above the door read Sentinel 1. She had not spent long on the name. It had come to her on a February morning run, And it had the quality of the right answer, which is that it required no defense. She did not advertise. She posted a single notice at a community center, a library branch, and a women's health clinic in the neighborhood, and she waited. The first inquiry came within 4 days. The first class, 8 women ranging in age from 19 to 54, met on a Tuesday evening in April. They had in common that they had found the notice and shown up, which Elena understood to be a form of courage that people who had never needed it tended to underestimate. She did not teach them what she had learned at Fort Bragg. The contexts were different and the purpose was different. What she taught them was what Frank had taught her before any of the rest of it, the foundational things that preceded technique. How to read a room before it required reading. How to manage the internal state that crisis produces, because competence under pressure is not a talent. It is a practiced physiological response, and it can be developed by anyone willing to put in the time. She taught them to breathe. She taught them to look. She taught them to make decisions in advance so that when the moment arrived, they were not making a first decision, but executing a prepared one. She was a spare teacher. She did not lecture. She demonstrated and observed and corrected, and when something was right, she said so and moved on. And when something was wrong, she said so and showed why. Her students learned that she was not withholding warmth, she was simply serious, and that seriousness was itself a form of respect. She was treating them as people capable of competence. They responded the way people respond when someone takes them seriously. Word spread the way things spread in small communities when they meet a genuine need. By June, the Tuesday class was full. By August, she had added a Thursday class and a Saturday morning session. She hired a second instructor for Saturdays, a woman named Ruth, who had 12 years in the Army Reserve and a patience for beginners that Elena admired and acknowledged she did not fully share. Ruth was good. The students loved her. Elena did not give interviews. A journalist from a Denver weekly called twice, and she did not return the calls. She was not interested in the story of herself. She was interested in the work. The story was a distraction from the work, and the work was the point. She ran in the mornings and trained in the afternoons and taught in the evenings. And she was in the careful and provisional way she had learned to assess such things all right. Not happy in any simple sense. Not the version of herself she had imagined during long nights in places she was not allowed to name, but all right, present, purposeful, moving. She still carried the notebook. On a Thursday evening in October, 10 months after Hargrove Diner, the last student to leave was a young woman named Claire Weston. 22 years old, slight, with serious eyes, in the habit of staying after class to ask questions she had been holding during the session. One of Elena's better students, not because she was gifted, but because she was thorough, and thoroughness was rarer and more valuable than talent. Claire was rolling up her mat when she asked the question. Were you scared? She didn't look up, immediately giving Elena the option of treating it as casual. That night, at the restaurant, Elena was by the shelf. She stopped. She was about to answer when the door opened and Ruth came back in. She had forgotten her keys, and in passing, Ruth set a printed intake form on Elena's table. A new student registration from earlier that week flagged for a paperwork correction. Elena's eye caught the emergency contact line the way a trained eye catches details without looking for them. Emergency contact Nora Weston Naywells. Elena looked at it for 3 seconds. Then she looked at Claire. She ran the arithmetic without wanting to. Claire Weston, 22 years old. Nora Wells. Elena had encountered that name twice in her life. The first time was in passing a reservation on a board at Hargrove Diner, a name she had noted and filed as she noted and filed everything. The second time was in Royce's account of the investigation, the logistics coordinator at Veltran, who had passed Marcus information about Elena's whereabouts, had done so in connection with a broader surveillance of several names, people who might know something about the Kunar operation, people who might be moved to ask questions. Among the names on that secondary list was a Nora Wells, wife of a defense policy consultant, a woman who had been scheduled to dine at Hargrove that same evening. Her reservation had been moved at the last minute because the restaurant had overbooked the east section. Claire did not know any of this. That much was clear from her face. She had found the notice at a community center and walked in one Tuesday evening because she had read about a woman who had done something that mattered and she wanted to learn. Her mother had never told her about the night her reservation was moved because Nora Wells had never understood the significance of it. You cannot tell your daughter about the danger you never knew was there. Elena looked at Claire for a long moment. Then she crossed the floor, picked up Frank's notebook from the shelf, and carried it to the table between them. She opened it to the last page and set it flat. Claire read it. Her lips moved slightly over words that carried weight. She looked up. Do you know what it means? Elena went still in the way Frank had taught her, completely letting the variables settle before speaking. I think it means the skill is never the point, she said. The skill is what you build so you can do the thing that is the point. She paused. Which is knowing when to move, knowing when to wait, knowing when to stand between someone and something they don't see coming. She looked at Claire directly when she said the last part, not because Claire would understand the specific weight of it, because it was true and it was worth saying directly. Claire was quiet for a moment. Then, and that night, you knew. I knew the when, Elena said. The how follows if you've put in the hours. Claire looked at the notebook a moment longer. Then she picked up her mat and her bag. At the door, she paused. Thank you, she said. Not for tonight, for all of it. Elena nodded. She watched Claire walk out into the October night, the door swinging shut, the rectangle of Denver streetlight replaced by the rectangle of dark. She stood in the empty warehouse, the rubber mats, the north windows, the shelf. She thought about Claire driving home to a mother who had once been scheduled to be in a restaurant on a night that would have gone very differently if a reservation had not been moved at the last minute. She thought about what it means to protect someone who never knows they needed protecting and never needs to know because the point was never the credit. The point was that they got home. She thought about Gideon Marsh and a postcard with 4 words. She thought about her father on a mountain in Kunar province, holding a position in the dark so 3 men could get out. She thought this is what the holding was for. Not the 17 seconds, not the notebook, not the name above the door. This, a young woman rolling up her mat in a warehouse in Denver, learning to read a room before a room, requires reading, driving home safe to a mother who would never know why and did not need to. This was what it was for. She picked up Frank's notebook from the table, held it in both hands for a moment, the worn cover, the bowed spine, all of it. She brought it back to the shelf and set it in its place, next to the postcard from Montana, next to Frank's photograph, next to all of it. She turned off the lights. She locked the door. She walked out into the October air, dry and clean. The altitude of Denver giving everything that slight additional clarity, the stars harder and more numerous than they had any right to be above a city this size. She walked to her car. She drove home through the streets she had made hers, past the coffee place and the park and the elementary school with the painted fence, the children's handprints, in a dozen colors spreading the full length of the block. She ate, she went to bed. She slept without dreaming, or if she dreamed, she did not remember it when she woke, which amounted to the same thing. In the morning, she ran. She ran the same route she ran every morning through the neighborhood she had learned, block by block in the cold of January, through streets that her body knew before her mind caught up. The air was cold enough to clarify. The city was beginning its day in the incremental way cities do, lights coming on in windows. Cars starting to move, the whole ordinary machinery of other people's lives assembling itself around her. She ran and she breathed and she thought about nothing except the next step and the step after that, which is all running ever really requires. She ran past the elementary school. She ran past the bird feeder she had installed on the fence outside the community center 2 months ago, slightly unlevel. She noticed now sitting at a small angle that she had not corrected and would not correct because it was the kind of detail that birds adapted to and the birds had. Frank would have recognized that. She ran. That evening, 7 students arrived for the Thursday class. Elena was there when they came in the warehouse, lit the mats down, the space ready. She watched them settle jackets off, brief greetings, the small social adjustments of the group that is formed around a shared purpose. They were ordinary people with ordinary lives full of ordinary complications. None of them would ever be what she was. That was not the point and had never been. She called the class to order. They formed up. She looked at them, looking at her. "We are going to work on spatial awareness tonight," she said. Her voice was even and clear. "Knowing where you are before something requires you to know where you are." She let that sit for a second, because that is the whole thing. If you know where you are already ahead. She moved them through the first drill, the warehouse filled with the sound of effort and attention. Outside, Denver went about its October evening, unhurried, enormous, ordinary. The sign above the door caught the light from the alley's street lamp, white letters on dark paint, plain and sufficient. Sentinel 1. Frank would have liked it. She was certain of that. She moved to the next drill,